The heavy golden doors of the grand palace swung open, revealing a world of blinding crystal chandeliers and suffocating velvet. Sarah stood at the center of the polished marble floor, feeling entirely out of place in her simple linen dress. It was the night of the fated mating ceremony, the night the moon goddess was supposed to bind her soul to the Alpha King. She could feel the magnetic, intoxicating pull of the bond humming in her blood as King Kaelen descended the grand staircase. He was a vision of terrifying power and flawless royal perfection. But as he stepped before her, his sharp, icy eyes did not seek her soul. His gaze dropped to her hands. Her fingers were stained dark with the rich, fertile earth of the royal gardens, the only place she ever felt truly alive. A heavy, mocking silence fell over the glittering nobility. Kaelen curled his lip in absolute disgust, his voice echoing coldly across the vast hall. He sneered that she came before him with the filth of a peasant on her skin. "You're supposed to be my fated queen, yet you look like a lowborn servant," he declared. "I will never bind my soul to a pathetic, unrefined creature who prefers mud to gold. I reject this bond." The collective laughter of 100 cruel aristocrats shattered the air, a piercing sound that tore through Sarah like jagged glass. Humiliation burned hot in her chest, suffocating and complete. She did not cry. She simply turned her back on the laughing court, on the cruel king, who could only see the dirt on her skin, but not the life within it, and fled into the cold, forgiving embrace of the night. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The wooden wheels of the carriage rattled against the uneven cobblestones as the grand capital faded into the distance behind her. Sarah sat entirely alone in the back of the small merchant wagon, wrapped in a simple woven traveler cloak that offered a sharp contrast to the suffocating velvet she had been forced to wear just a day before. She had been officially banished by the High Council, exiled to the blighted lands of the South as a punishment for embarrassing the Alpha King. Her royal titles had been stripped away, her name erased from the registry of the High Court. To the world, she was a disgraced Omega, a broken creature who had failed her only purpose in life. But as she watched the lush, manicured forests of the Northern Territory slowly give way to the rugged, untamed wilderness, a profound and unexpected sense of relief washed over her chest. For her entire life in the capital, she had been completely invisible. She was treated as a delicate ornament, expected to sit silently in gilded rooms and smile at vain aristocrats who only valued power and appearance. The only place she had ever found a true sense of belonging was on her knees in the hidden corners of the royal gardens, digging her fingers into the dark soil and coaxing fragile seedlings to life. King Kaelen had looked at her soil-stained hands and seen only filth and failure. He had no idea that those stains were the only things that had kept her sane in a court completely devoid of genuine warmth. His cruel public rejection had certainly shattered her pride in the moment, but as the miles stretched on, she realized he had actually handed her the ultimate gift. He had given her freedom. The landscape began to change drastically as the wagon crossed the southern border. The vibrant greens of the north withered into dull browns and ashen grays. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on the carriage with an oppressive dry heat that tasted of dust and forgotten promises. This was the southern blight, a vast expanse of barren territory that the kingdom had abandoned decades ago, after a mysterious, prolonged drought turned the fertile plains into a sprawling wasteland. The carriage driver, a gruff beta who had not spoken a single word to her during the entire journey, finally pulled the exhausted horses to a halt at the edge of a crumbling stone manor. He turned around, his face masked with a mixture of pity and annoyance, stating flatly that this was as far as he would go. He warned her firmly that the land was dead and nothing could survive the coming summer heat, so she should pray to the moon goddess for a quick end. Sarah simply met his gaze and offered him a gentle, polite nod, telling him to journey safely back to the north and leave her to her chosen fate. She stepped down from the wooden wagon, her worn leather boots sinking into the fine, dry dust. The driver did not wait. He cracked his whip, and the wagon turned back toward the capital, leaving her completely alone in the endless sea of cracked earth. Sarah stood in silence as the sound of the wagon faded into the howling of the dry wind. The sun beat down relentlessly against her shoulders, but she did not seek the shade of the ruined manor. Instead, she walked out into the center of the vast barren field. The earth beneath her feet was webbed with deep, thirsty cracks, looking like the shattered fragments of a forgotten world. The air was entirely silent, devoid of birdsong or the rustling of leaves. To anyone else from the capital, this place would be a literal hell, a terrifying tomb of isolation and slow starvation. But as Sarah looked out over the endless expanse of empty land, her heart began to beat with a wild, exhilarating rhythm. There were no judging eyes here. There were no whispering counselors, no cruel kings, and no impossible standards of beauty. There was only the open sky and the raw, waiting earth. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of sun-baked clay and dry wind, feeling a powerful surge of empowerment course through her veins. She was no longer a silent prisoner in a golden cage. She was the sole sovereign of this forgotten realm. Driven by an instinct she had kept suppressed for years, Sarah slowly dropped to her knees in the center of the blighted field. She pushed back the sleeves of her simple linen dress and pressed her bare palms flat against the scorching cracked soil. She closed her eyes, tuning out the heat of the sun and the howling of the wind, allowing her consciousness to sink deep into the ground. Her unique hidden gift began to manifest a beautiful intuitive connection to the natural world that transcended ordinary science. Through the rough calluses on her fingertips, she could read the exact mineral composition of the earth below. She felt the heavy deposits of iron, the sleeping layers of nitrogen, and the desperate lack of surface moisture. The soil was severely parched, crying out for salvation, but it was absolutely not dead. It was merely waiting. Sarah pushed her senses deeper past the hard clay crust, past the layers of dry rock, reaching down into the darkest subterranean depths of the earth. Her breath caught in her throat as a sudden powerful vibration echoed against her palms. It was faint but entirely undeniable. Deep beneath the barren wasteland, buried under miles of solid rock, she felt the steady rushing pulse of a massive hidden underground aquifer. The land was not a graveyard, it was a dormant paradise, and she alone held the key to waking it up. A small, confident smile finally touched her lips as she opened her eyes, looking out at the endless horizon with a fierce newfound determination. The real work was about to begin. Sarah did not waste a single moment mourning her past. The very next morning, before the harsh southern sun could fully crest the horizon, she began her monumental task. Armed with nothing but a rusted iron spade she found in the ruins of the manor and her own extraordinary intuition, she set out to map the hidden veins of the underground. She walked for miles across the cracked basin, dropping to her knees every 100 paces to press her bare hands against the scorching earth. Her gift allowed her to see past the barren surface, visualizing the dark rushing waters trapped beneath the bedrock. She felt the vibrations of the subterranean currents hum against her palms, guiding her steps like a living compass. She marked the pressure points with small piles of white stones, tracing the intricate pathways of the hidden river. The physical labor was brutal. The blistering heat beat down upon her shoulders, turning her skin a deep golden brown, while the sharp rocks tore at the delicate soles of her boots. Yet with every blister that formed and every drop of sweat that soaked her simple linen dress, Sarah felt an intoxicating surge of genuine power. She was no longer the fragile, useless Omega the capital had mocked. She was an architect of life, and the earth was bending to her quiet, brilliant will. Once the network was fully mapped, she identified the absolute weakest point in the bedrock, a shallow depression near the foothills, where the subterranean pressure was at its peak. For weeks she dug relentlessly. Her hands, once perfectly manicured for royal galas, became rough, callous, and permanently stained with the deep, rich color of the soil. Her muscles ached with a deep, satisfying exhaustion she had never known in the velvet-draped rooms of the palace. She worked from the first light of dawn until the silver glow of the moon illuminated the valley, driven by a fierce, unyielding purpose. When her spade finally broke through the final layer of hardened clay, the response was immediate and terrifyingly beautiful. A low rumble echoed from the depths of the earth, followed by a magnificent geyser of pure freezing water that erupted into the dry morning air. Sarah stood completely drenched in the miraculous shower, laughing out loud for the very first time in her entire life. The sound was bright and untamed, echoing across the empty wasteland as the crystal-clear water cascaded over her shoulders, washing away the last lingering shadows of King Kaelen. But finding the water was only the beginning. With the primary well established, Sarah immediately set to work designing a complex gravity-fed irrigation system to distribute the life-giving resource across the barren plains. Utilizing the natural slope of the valley and the crumbling stone blocks from the ruined manor, she constructed a series of intricate aqueducts and branching trenches. She calculated the precise angles required to maintain a steady, gentle flow, ensuring that the water would reach the furthest edges of her fields without eroding the fragile topsoil. It was a masterclass in botanical engineering, born entirely from her brilliant, intuitive mind. She worked alone, a solitary figure moving gracefully through the dust, orchestrating a massive symphony of earth and water. When she finally opened the main wooden sluice gate, the cinematic beauty of the moment was absolutely overwhelming. The water surged forward, flowing smoothly into the dry, dusty trenches like liquid silver. She watched with tears of profound joy welling in her eyes as the parched, cracked earth eagerly drank the moisture, darkening into a rich, fertile loam. The suffocating smell of dust was instantly replaced by the intoxicating, heavy scent of wet soil and raw potential. Now she needed crops that could survive the extreme temperature fluctuations of the blighted lands. In the cool, damp cellar of the ruined manor, she established a makeshift laboratory. She gathered wild, hardy scrub weeds that managed to survive the harsh southern winds and carefully crossbred them with a handful of delicate wheat and barley seeds she had smuggled out of the capital in her pockets. She spent countless sleepless nights under the flickering light of a single tallow candle, meticulously pollinating the blossoms by hand. She isolated the genetic traits that offered extreme drought resistance and rapid root growth, weaving them together with the high-yield properties of the north. She relied entirely on her extraordinary touch, feeling the vibrating life force within each tiny seed, discarding the weak and nurturing the strong. When she finally planted her experimental hybrid seeds into the newly moistened trenches, she felt a profound connection to the earth that transcended the old fated bond she had lost. She was breathing her very soul into the dirt, acting as the true mother of the harvest. The results of her brilliant labor completely defied the natural laws of the kingdom. Within a matter of weeks, vibrant emerald green shoots shattered the dark soil, reaching hungrily toward the sun. The isolated patches of green quickly spread, transforming the once desolate gray valley into a breathtaking sea of swaying golden wheat and lush, vibrant crops. Sarah stood on the crumbling balcony of her manor, looking out over the endless acres of absolute abundance she had created with her own two hands. The breeze rustled through the heavy grain, creating a beautiful whispering melody that filled her heart with an unshakable peace. She had not just survived her exile, she had completely conquered it. But this impossible miracle could not stay hidden forever. A strange, heavy tension hung in the warm evening air as a lost, starving merchant traveling far off his usual trade route stumbled onto the high ridge overlooking her valley. His sunken eyes widened in absolute terrifying shock as he stared down at the impossible shimmering oasis, completely unaware that the incredible news he was about to carry back north would irrevocably change the fate of the entire world. 3 years later, the majestic northern capital was entirely unrecognizable. The grand crystal chandeliers still hung in the palace halls, but their light illuminated nothing but despair and hollow faces. An unprecedented catastrophic drought had descended upon the northern territories, choking the life out of the once fertile plains and turning the roaring rivers into trickling muddy streams. The royal gardens, where lush roses and climbing vines used to flourish, were now nothing more than expanses of cracked dead earth and withered gray stalks. King Kaelen stood on the high stone balcony of his fortress, staring down at the starving city, with a heavy crushing weight pressing against his chest. He was the Alpha King, the supreme military commander of the most powerful army in the known world. His raw physical strength could crush boulders, and his tactical brilliance had conquered neighboring empires, but all of his mighty alpha power was completely useless against the silent creeping enemy of starvation. He could not swing a sword to make the rain fall. He could not intimidate the scorched soil into yielding crops. For the very first time in his entire life, the mighty sovereign felt entirely, utterly powerless. Beneath the immediate panic of the famine, a strange phantom ache continuously throbbed in his chest, an empty hollow space where his fated bond was supposed to reside. He had convinced himself that the pain was simply the stress of his dying kingdom, entirely refusing to acknowledge the memory of the quiet, dirt-stained Omega he had banished to the south. Kaelen turned away from the desolate view and walked heavy-stepped into the Grand Council chamber. The room that had once echoed with the cruel, arrogant laughter of the nobility was now suffocatingly silent. The high aristocrats who had mocked Sarah 3 years ago now sat slumped in their gilded chairs, their fine velvet robes hanging loosely over gaunt, thinning frames. Their superficial beauty had entirely faded, revealing the weak, fragile cores beneath their wealth. The royal treasurer reported with a trembling voice that the central grain silos were entirely empty, and the outer provinces had already begun to riot over bread. The entire kingdom was simply a few short weeks away from absolute total collapse. The counselors bickered weakly among themselves, blaming the moon goddess, blaming the neighboring territories, and blaming the relentless weather, but offering absolutely no practical solutions. Kaelen watched them with a dark, simmering rage, realizing that their lifelong obsession with status and appearance had completely blinded them to the brutal realities of survival. They were beautiful, useless ornaments shattering under the very first sign of genuine hardship. He slammed his heavy fist against the massive oak table, silencing the room instantly. He demanded a real solution, refusing to watch his empire crumble into dust while his counselors wept over their lost gold. It was then that the captain of the border guard stepped forward, dragging a ragged, exhausted merchant into the center of the hall. The merchant fell to his knees, his lips cracked and bleeding, but his sunken eyes wide with a feverish, desperate light. He stammered out a story that sounded like absolute madness to the starving, cynical court. He claimed he had gotten lost near the southern border, wandering deep into the blighted lands to die. But the land was not dead. He spoke of an impossible, breathtaking oasis completely hidden in the dangerous southern basin. He described endless rolling fields of towering golden wheat, crystal-clear aqueducts flowing with pure life-giving water, and lush emerald greenhouses boldly defying the scorching sun. He spoke of a mysterious sovereign who ruled this agricultural paradise, a brilliant, enigmatic woman the local travelers had reverently begun to call the Lady of the Harvest. The counselors immediately erupted into skeptical outrage, declaring it impossible for anything to grow in the toxic southern wasteland. But Kaelen stared intently at the merchant, his sharp alpha instincts flaring with a sudden desperate spark of hope. The merchant swore on his very life that the massive silos of the south were overflowing with enough grain to feed the entire northern kingdom 10 times over. The room fell into a heavy, stunned silence as the sheer magnitude of the revelation washed over the court. The salvation of their magnificent empire did not lie in their useless gold, their vast armies, or their ancient pure bloodlines. It lay entirely in the hands of an unknown woman in the most despised barren territory of the continent. Kaelen knew exactly what he had to do. He could not send a violent army to take the food by force for fear of destroying the miraculous delicate crops, and he could not send an arrogant counselor to negotiate for fear of sparking a war. He had to go himself. The great Alpha King would have to ride south, strip away his royal pride, and beg this lady of the harvest for the survival of his people. He stood up from his throne, his massive frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the polished marble floor, and ordered his elite vanguard to saddle their strongest remaining horses. He declared that they would ride for the blighted lands at first light. As he walked out of the council chamber preparing for the most grueling journey of his life, a strange, sudden pull tugged sharply at his soul. It was a familiar, agonizing hum deep in his blood, drawing his gaze instinctively toward the southern horizon. He dismissed it as simple desperation, but a massive cliffhanger hung heavily in the dry air as the mighty king prepared to march into the vast unknown, completely unaware that he was riding straight toward the ultimate reckoning of his past and the brilliant, empowered woman he had foolishly thrown away. The relentless sun hung in the cloudless sky like a tarnished copper coin, casting a brutal, unforgiving heat over the dying northern plains. King Kaelen rode at the head of his elite vanguard, his massive black warhorse, kicking up plumes of dry gray ash with every heavy step. The journey south had been a grueling descent into absolute despair. The vibrant, manicured forests he once patrolled with arrogant pride were now nothing more than skeletal timber snapping under the weight of the howling wind. As they rode through the outer provinces, Kaelen was forced to witness the devastating reality of his failure as a sovereign. He saw the hollow faces of starving commoners huddled in the shadows of crumbling stone bridges, their desperate eyes tracking his royal procession not with the traditional awe he was accustomed to, but with a haunting, hollow emptiness. Every sunken cheek and frail, outstretched hand felt like a physical blow to his chest, entirely dismantling his legendary alpha pride. He was a conqueror who had expanded the borders of the empire with raw military might, yet he could not provide a single loaf of bread to the people who depended on his protection. The heavy golden crown resting upon his brow no longer felt like a symbol of divine right. It felt like a crushing, suffocating weight of absolute failure. For 3 grueling days, the royal procession pushed relentlessly toward the southern border, leaving the dying remnants of civilization behind. The air grew progressively thicker, the oppressive dry heat suffocating their lungs and coating their throats with a fine, bitter dust. Kaelen rode in absolute silence, his sharp, icy eyes scanning the desolate horizon for any sign of the miraculous oasis the merchant had spoken of. His elite guardsmen, men who had fearlessly charged into bloody battles against rival empires, now slumped in their saddles, entirely defeated by the relentless, invisible enemy of the drought. Kaelen felt a profound, gnawing guilt twisting in his stomach. He had spent his entire reign valuing superficial beauty and aggressive dominance, completely ignoring the quiet, nurturing forces required to truly sustain a kingdom. He thought of his glittering court and the useless, vain aristocrats who were currently hiding in their velvet-draped rooms waiting to die. They were a fragile, beautiful illusion entirely stripped away by the harsh reality of nature. As the vanguard finally crossed the ancient, invisible boundary into the dreaded, blighted lands, a sudden, inexplicable physical phenomenon completely violently seized the Alpha King. It began as a faint, rhythmic thumping deep within the marrow of his bones, a sensation he had not felt since the night of the grand mating ceremony 3 years ago. The severed, fated bond, the sacred connection he had so cruelly and publicly rejected, suddenly flared to life with a terrifying, blinding intensity. Kaelen gasped, his massive chest heaving as a rush of liquid heat coursed through his veins, entirely disorienting his heightened alpha senses. He gripped the leather reins of his horse so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white, his heart hammering against his ribs in a wild, frantic rhythm. The bond was pulling him, drawing his soul forward into the heart of the barren wasteland with an agonizing, irresistible force. It made absolutely no logical sense. His fated mate was an unrefined Omega. He had banished a woman who had surely perished in this harsh environment years ago. Yet the closer he rode toward the supposed domain of the Lady of the Harvest, the stronger and more intoxicating the pull became. The invisible tether wrapped around his heart, dragging him through the swirling dust with a desperate yearning he could not comprehend. It was not merely a physical attraction. It was a profound spiritual demand, a crying out of his very soul for the missing half he had foolishly discarded. Kaelen felt entirely, utterly vulnerable, his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling under the sheer weight of the supernatural connection. He urged his exhausted horse into a heavy gallop, leaving his confused guardsmen struggling to keep pace. He had to reach the source of this agonizing, beautiful pull. He had to know who or what was waiting for him at the end of the dying world. The wind whipped furiously against his face, carrying a massive blinding cloud of gray sand that completely obscured the path. The dust storm roared like a wounded beast, tearing at his heavy royal cloak and forcing him to blindly trust the agonizing pull of the bond guiding his heart through the absolute darkness. For hours, Kaelen rode through the suffocating tempest, his body pushed to the absolute limits of physical endurance. Just as his massive warhorse stumbled its strength, finally giving out beneath the brutal conditions, the howling wind suddenly abruptly died. The thick, swirling dust settled back to the earth, leaving an eerie, profound silence in his wake. Kaelen blinked his bloodshot eyes, struggling to clear the grit from his vision as a completely foreign sensation brushed against his skin. The air was no longer thick with dry ash. A cool, gentle breeze swept across his face, carrying a scent that completely paralyzed his rational mind. It was the rich, intoxicating fragrance of wet soil, blooming wildflowers, and heavy golden grain. His heart slammed violently against his ribcage, the fated bond screaming in his blood with a triumphant, agonizing resonance. Kaelen slowly dismounted his exhausted horse, his heavy boots touching the ground as he walked forward in an absolute daze. He crested the final rocky dune, his breath completely catching in his throat as his icy eyes widened in total terrifying awe. A massive cliffhanger hung in the fragrant evening air as the mighty Alpha King stared down at an impossible, breathtaking reality that completely shattered every single law of his dying world. Completely unaware of the absolute emotional devastation waiting for him in the valley below. The view from the rocky dune completely defied every natural law Kaelen had ever known. Stretching out beneath the shadow of the jagged mountains was a vast, breathtaking paradise of absolute vibrant life. Miles upon miles of towering golden wheat swayed gently in the evening breeze, creating a mesmerizing ocean of amber that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Cutting through the endless fields was a brilliant network of crystal-clear aqueducts, their silver waters reflecting the dying rays of the sun like ribbons of pure liquid diamond. Interspersed among the crops were massive, elegant greenhouses constructed from polished wood and clear glass, their emerald canopies bursting with rich green vines and heavy blooming flowers. It was an impossible, terrifyingly beautiful oasis thriving directly in the heart of the dead world. Kaelen felt his knees completely weaken under the sheer, overwhelming majesty of the sight. The drought had reduced his magnificent northern empire to a crumbling graveyard, yet here in the banished, blighted lands, life was not merely surviving, it was flourishing with a fierce, triumphant power. Every single vanity he had ever held dear felt entirely worthless in the face of this monumental achievement. His elite vanguard finally crested the ridge behind him, bringing their exhausted horses to a sudden dead halt. The battle-hardened guardsmen, men who had stared down massive enemy armies without flinching, wept openly at the sight of the rushing water, and Kaelen did not wait for them. He began his descent into the valley, his heavy boots slipping against the loose rocks until they finally met the soft, dark soil of the agricultural basin. The moment his feet touched the damp earth, the agonizing pull of the fated bond flared with an even more violent intensity. It was no longer a distant calling, it was a localized, screaming demand resonating through his chest with every single step he took. He walked through the towering stalks of wheat, his armored hands reaching out to graze the heavy grain. The sheer intellectual genius of the irrigation system became immediately apparent. He saw perfectly calculated, gravity-fed trenches, utilizing the natural slope of the basin to distribute water flawlessly to every single root without wasting a single precious drop. This was not magic. It was the work of a profound, brilliant mind, a master architect of life who understood the absolute, precise science of the earth far better than any scholar in his royal academy. As he ventured deeper into the lush sanctuary, Kaelen encountered the inhabitants of this hidden world. He expected to find ruthless mercenaries guarding the precious resources, but instead he saw ordinary working people. There were southern refugees, exiled commoners, and weary travelers who had stumbled into the valley and found salvation. Unlike the gaunt, dying citizens of his grand capital, these people possessed a glowing, radiant health and a quiet, unshakable dignity. They moved with a peaceful purpose, harvesting the grain and tending to the complex water gates with careful reverence. When they saw the massive Alpha King clad in his dark royal armor striding through their fields, they did not cower or bow in traditional subservience. They simply watched him with calm, confident eyes, pointing him silently toward the massive central greenhouse at the heart of the estate. Kaelen felt his legendary alpha confidence completely evaporate under their steady gaze. He prepared himself mentally to meet a formidable foreign dignitary, perhaps a brilliant elderly scholar, or a hidden noble who had hoarded ancient agricultural secrets for decades. He practiced his desperate pleas, ready to offer enormous chests of gold, grand royal titles, and his own personal pride to secure an alliance with the Lady of the Harvest. He reached the grand wooden doors of the central greenhouse, his heart hammering, a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The fated bond was an absolute roaring fire in his blood, entirely consuming his rational thoughts and drowning out everything else. He pushed the heavy doors open, stepping out of the dry evening breeze and into a world of thick, intoxicating humidity. The air inside the glass structure was incredibly rich, smelling of wet, fertile soil, crushed sweet mint, and blooming jasmine. The cinematic beauty of the interior was staggering to his desperate eyes. Massive vines cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, bearing heavy exotic fruits, while rows of rare, delicate medicinal herbs lined the terraced wooden planters. Kaelen walked slowly down the central aisle, the sound of his heavy boots muffled by the soft, thick moss beneath his feet. The bond pulled him forward like an invisible physical chain, dragging his gaze toward the far end of the sanctuary. There, bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun, stood the Lady of the Heart. She had her back entirely turned to him, completely absorbed in her meticulous, quiet labor. She was not a wealthy, haughty noble draped in jewels, nor an ancient scholarly lord holding a staff of power. She wore a simple, worn linen dress that hugged a delicate but incredibly strong frame, and a wide-brimmed woven sun hat completely obscured her hair. Her bare arms were dusted with dark soil, moving with a rhythmic, mesmerizing grace as she carefully repotted a fragile flowering vine into a larger clay vessel. Kaelen felt the absolute air leave his lungs, leaving him completely breathless. The agonizing magnetic pull of the bond was violently anchoring itself directly to her quiet, unassuming figure, connecting his massive soul to her delicate form. His massive chest heaved, his vocal cords completely paralyzed by the overwhelming spiritual resonance crashing through his exhausted body. He opened his mouth to speak, to announce his royal presence and beg for urgent mercy. But a massive, heavy cliffhanger hung in the humid air as she suddenly paused her work, her shoulders stiffening, noticeably as she finally sensed the powerful alpha energy flooding her sanctuary, preparing to turn around and entirely shatter his world. The heavy, humid air of the greenhouse seemed to freeze completely as the mysterious woman paused her movements. She did not startle or gasp like a frightened commoner confronted by the massive presence of an alpha king. Instead, she calmly set down the small clay vessel she was holding and slowly wiped her soil-stained hands on the coarse linen apron tied around her waist. Kaelen stood entirely paralyzed, his massive chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow breaths as the screaming, fated bond in his blood reached an absolute deafening crescendo. He watched with wide, terrified eyes as she reached up and gracefully pulled the wide woven sun hat from her head, allowing a cascade of thick dark hair to tumble freely over her shoulders. The golden rays of the setting sun filtering through the glass ceiling caught the rich, warm tones of her skin, illuminating her features in a breathtaking, ethereal glow. She turned around to face him completely, and the entire universe as King Kaelen knew it violently and irrevocably shattered into a million jagged pieces. It was Thera. The disgraced, unrefined Omega he had brutally humiliated and banished to the dying southern lands 3 years ago. Kaelen felt a massive physical blow strike him straight in the chest, driving the air from his lungs with a devastating, agonizing force. His sharp, icy eyes widened to their absolute limits, his mind desperately struggling to process the impossible, terrifying reality standing before him. The fragile, trembling girl he remembered from the Grand Palace, the one who had worn suffocating velvet and looked at him with terrified, hopeful eyes, was completely gone. In her place stood a magnificent, radiant queen of the earth. Her skin was kissed a deep golden brown by the southern sun, her posture was impossibly straight, and her bright eyes held a fierce, cool intelligence that absolutely commanded the room. She was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was not the shallow, fragile beauty of the northern aristocrats he had always favored. It was a raw, powerful, wild beauty, completely forged in the crucible of isolation and hard labor. She was the absolute master of this domain, the brilliant architect of life, and the savior of his entire dying world. The agonizing realization of his monumental, catastrophic mistake crashed over him like a suffocating tidal wave. He had stood in his glittering palace, surrounded by vain, useless nobles, and looked at this incredible, brilliant woman with absolute disgust. He had mocked the dark, rich soil on her hands, calling her a filthy peasant, completely unfit to stand beside a conquering sovereign. He had thrown away the most precious divine gift the moon goddess had ever bestowed upon him, entirely blinded by his own toxic, arrogant vanity. And now his magnificent northern empire was crumbling into dry dust. His people were starving in the streets, and his mighty, invincible armies were entirely useless. The only thing standing between his kingdom and absolute, total annihilation was the brilliant agricultural genius of the very Omega he had discarded. Kaelen looked down at her hands, the very hands he had so cruelly mocked. They were rough, calloused, and heavily stained with the dark, fertile earth of the sanctuary. But in his desperate, starving eyes, that soil no longer looked like filth. It looked like salvation. It looked like the absolute most precious substance in the entire world, far more valuable than all the gold stored in his royal vaults. A profound, soul-crushing remorse completely eclipsed his legendary alpha pride. The invisible fated bond that he had so violently severed at the mating ceremony now wrapped around his heart with a punishing, agonizing grip, dragging him downward with the sheer heavy weight of his unforgivable sins. Kaelen, the supreme military commander of the North, the undefeated Alpha King, whose very name struck absolute terror into the hearts of rival empires, could no longer support his own weight. His massive legs simply gave out beneath him. The heavy dark metal of his royal armor clanked loudly against the ground as he fell completely forward, dropping to his knees in the damp, dark soil directly before her. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders shaking with a profound, agonizing vulnerability he had never shown to another living soul. He was kneeling in the very dirt he had once despised, entirely surrendering his immense power and sovereign authority to the quiet, magnificent Omega standing above him. It was a cinematic, staggering reversal of fate, a perfect poetic justice delivered by the relentless hands of nature herself. Sarah did not step back. She did not tremble, weep, or throw herself into the arms of her fated mate. She simply stood her ground, looking down at the massive broken king kneeling in her greenhouse with an expression of absolute cool detachment. For 3 years she had built a beautiful, thriving world entirely without him, proving to herself and the earth that she never needed his validation to bloom. She watched the powerful Alpha who had shattered her heart into pieces now pressing his forehead toward the floor of her sanctuary, his legendary arrogance completely pulverized into dust. Kaelen slowly lifted his head, his icy eyes entirely bloodshot and filled with a desperate, pleading agony as he looked up at the woman he had so foolishly. He opened his mouth, his voice cracking, as he whispered her name, a broken, haunting sound that carried the heavy, crushing weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. But Sarah simply tilted her chin, her hazel eyes completely unyielding as she looked down at him. A massive, heavy cliffhanger hung in the humid, fragrant air as she folded her soil-stained arms across her chest, entirely unbothered by his royal tears, preparing to deliver a cold, brilliant ultimatum that would completely rewrite the laws of his desperate, dying kingdom. The heavy, humid silence in the massive glass greenhouse stretched into a suffocating eternity, broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of the fallen king. Kaelen knelt in the damp, dark soil, his massive frame trembling uncontrollably under the crushing, agonizing weight of his absolute remorse. He forced the desperate words past his completely paralyzed vocal cords, his voice a harsh, broken whisper that sounded absolutely nothing like the mighty, undefeated sovereign of the Northern Empire. He pleaded for her forgiveness, abandoning every shred of his legendary royal dignity as he confessed his profound, terrifying blindness. He spoke of the starving capital, the dying children in the dusty streets, and the horrific drought that had reduced his magnificent empire to a crumbling gray wasteland. He admitted that his toxic obsession with superficial, aristocratic beauty and traditional brute power had completely blinded him to the true, brilliant essence of the divine gift the moon goddess offered. He begged her to look past the cruel, arrogant fool he had been 3 years ago at the grand mating ceremony and to show unmerited mercy to the thousands of desperate lives currently perishing in the barren North. His apology was desperate, raw, and entirely genuine, driven by the awakened, fated bond screaming in his blood, demanding that he submit utterly to his true equal. Sarah listened to his sprawling confession without a single flicker of sympathy crossing her sun-kissed face. Internally, the fated bond pulled violently at her heart, a deep, ancient magic urging her to reach out and comfort her kneeling, crying, "Mate." But Sarah was absolutely no longer the fragile, terrified girl who had wept silently outside the towering palace gates. The harsh, relentless southern winds and the grueling daily physical labor had forged her soft spirit into an unbreakable, permanent vessel of quiet, terrifying power. She vividly remembered the blinding crystal chandeliers, the suffocating heavy velvet, and the cruel, mocking laughter of the aristocrats who had sneered at her dirty hands. She looked down at the massive Alpha King, pressing his forehead toward the floor of her lush sanctuary, and felt an absolute chilling calm settle over her soul. She did not feel the petty need for vengeance, but she also entirely refused to be his convenient savior out of blind, submissive duty. When he finally fell silent, waiting desperately for her divine judgment, she did not offer him a warm, forgiving embrace or a tearful, emotional reunion. She simply told him with a voice as cool as the underground aquifer that the North was no longer her home and its starving aristocrats were no longer her concern. Kaelen flinched violently as if she had struck him physically with a heavy iron blade, his icy eyes widening in sheer absolute terror at the devastating prospect of her refusal. But Sarah simply turned gracefully, walking away from him toward a heavy oak table covered in complex, detailed agricultural schematics and intricate botanical maps. She picked up a thick roll of woven parchment she had carefully prepared the very moment her outer border scouts had reported a desperate northern vanguard approaching the hidden valley. She walked back to the kneeling king and dropped the heavy document directly into the fertile dirt before his armored knees. She stated with unyielding authority that she would not let the innocent commoners of the North perish, but she would never again allow the royal court to dictate her worth or steal the fruits of her labor. The document was a formal non-negotiable treaty of total sovereign independence. She demanded that the blighted lands be permanently severed from the Northern Empire, exempt from its archaic restrictive laws and heavy royal taxation. She would be recognized as the sole absolute ruler of the Southern Territory. The undisputed queen of the harvest, and the Northern Kingdom would have to treat her as an equal sovereign power rather than a banished Omega subject. The breathtaking audacity of her demand would have been considered high treason just a few short years ago, punishable by immediate execution. No reigning Alpha King in the history of the realm had ever willingly surrendered territory to an Omega, let alone signed a binding treaty dictated by a disgraced exile. But Kaelen did not feel a single ounce of royal outrage or wounded alpha pride. As he looked up at her fierce, brilliant hazel eyes, he felt nothing but a profound, staggering awe. She had taken a dead, abandoned wasteland that his armies could not conquer and built a thriving, lush empire entirely with her bare hands and her magnificent, unparalleled intellect. She had unequivocally earned every single right to demand this absolute independence. Without a moment of hesitation, Kaelen reached for the small iron dagger strapped to his heavy, dark leather belt. He did not ask for a royal quill or formal ink. He sliced the sharp blade directly across the palm of his own hand, wincing slightly as the bright crimson blood welled instantly to the surface. He pressed his bleeding palm firmly against the bottom of the woven parchment, sealing the Treaty of Independence with his royal blood, completely surrendering his absolute dominion over the southern lands. Sarah watched him sign away a massive portion of his kingdom, with a faint, subtle flicker of genuine surprise finally softening the sharp edges of her hazel eyes. She had fully expected the proud conqueror to argue endlessly, bargain desperately, or threaten her with his remaining army. Instead, he had broken his fierce alpha pride, submitting entirely to her brilliant mind with a humble reverence. Kaelen slowly looked up at her, his bleeding hand resting in the dark soil, his broken soul entirely laid bare before her ultimate judgment. He whispered that the treaty was permanently sealed, and the South was hers forever, asking softly if she would now share her miraculous harvest with his dying people. Sarah slowly nodded, picking up the blood-stained parchment and securing it safely in the pocket of her woven apron. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. She told him that the massive grain silos were indeed full, and the life-saving harvest was ready to be transported to the sea. But a massive cinematic cliffhanger hung in the humid air as she looked down at his royal armor and coldly informed him that her workers were too busy tending the crops to load the heavy wagons for him. If the great undefeated Alpha King truly wanted to save his dying empire, he would have to strip off his useless royal metal, pick up a rusted iron shovel, and learn exactly how to sweat in the dirt beside her. The early morning sun rose over the majestic southern oasis, casting a warm golden glow across the endless fields of swaying wheat. King Kaelen did not summon his exhausted vanguard to do the heavy labor for him. Instead, he stood at the edge of the sprawling farmlands and began to systematically strip away the heavy dark metal of his royal armor. The massive iron chest plate fell to the damp soil with a dull thud, followed by the intricate steel gauntlets and the thick velvet cape that had always symbolized his absolute sovereign authority. Dressed only in a simple white linen tunic and sturdy leather trousers, the mighty Alpha King stepped barefoot into the cool dark mud of the irrigation trenches. He picked up a heavy rusted iron shovel, his broad muscular shoulders bracing for the grueling physical labor he had demanded of his lowest servants for his entire reign. Sarah stood on the elevated wooden platform of the central aqueduct, watching him with a cool, calculating gaze. She was entirely prepared for the arrogant conqueror to abandon the grueling task within a single hour, entirely unaccustomed to the blistering southern heat and the backbreaking reality of agricultural survival. But as the morning stretched into a brutal, sweltering afternoon, Kaelen did not stop or complain for a single second. He drove the heavy iron blade of the shovel deep into the hardened clay, his massive chest heaving with exertion as he meticulously followed the complex geometric pathways Sarah had mapped out for the new water channels. The royal tunic clung tightly to his sweat, drenched back, revealing the powerful, rippling muscles that had once conquered rival empires, now entirely dedicated to nurturing the fragile earth. Sarah walked slowly along the edge of the newly dug trench, her sharp hazel eyes assessing his rough, uneven work. She called down to him, her voice cutting through the humid air with crisp, unyielding authority, instructing him to adjust the angle of the trench by a fraction of an inch to prevent the fragile topsoil from eroding under the rushing water. She expected him to bristle at the strict command or argue with her logic, but Kaelen simply wiped the heavy sweat from his brow and immediately corrected his stance. He listened to her brilliant, complex instructions with an absolute rapt fascination, entirely mesmerized by the sheer depth of her botanical intellect. He asked her questions about the specific mineral composition of the soil and the precise gravity calculations required for the aqueducts, his deep voice vibrating with a profound, genuine respect that made the fated bond hum beautifully in the warm air. For the first time in her entire life, Sarah felt genuinely seen, not as a fragile ornamental omega, but as a powerful, brilliant equal. The slow burn romance between them began to take root in the dark, fertile mud stripped entirely of all royal vanity and shallow court tradition. She climbed down from the wooden platform and knelt beside him in the trench, her bare soil-stained hands reaching out to guide the heavy iron blade of his shovel. When her rough, callous fingers accidentally brushed against his large, blistering hands, a sudden violent spark of pure electricity shot up her arm, entirely stealing the breath from her lungs. Kaelen froze completely, his icy blue eyes snapping up to meet her sharp hazel gaze. The physical proximity between them was suddenly suffocatingly intense, the air heavy with the intoxicating scent of crushed mint, wet earth, and raw masculine sweat. He did not pull away from her touch. Instead, he slowly lowered the heavy shovel, allowing her small, capable hands to guide his movements, entirely surrendering his massive physical strength to her flawless technical precision. It was a beautiful, silent dance of absolute equality, a profound merging of brute alpha power and brilliant omega intellect that perfectly balanced the scales of their fractured souls. As they worked side by side in the scorching southern heat, Kaelen felt the last lingering remnants of his toxic royal pride entirely melt away into the earth. He realized with a staggering emotional clarity that this back-breaking labor was the most honorable thing he had ever done in his entire life. He was not destroying cities or taking lives. He was actively building a future alongside the most magnificent woman he had ever known. He watched the way the golden sunlight caught the subtle, fierce curve of her jaw, and the way her brilliant mind constantly calculated the flow of the water, completely falling in love with the magnificent mind he had once foolishly discarded. He wanted to reach out and pull her into his arms to beg her once again for a chance to heal the massive wounds he had inflicted upon her heart, but he knew he had to earn her trust through silent, relentless devotion. He swallowed his desperate words and focused entirely on the dark soil beneath him, letting his bleeding, blistering hands speak the absolute profound truth of his unending remorse as he tirelessly moved the heavy earth. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged mountain peaks, casting long purple shadows across the sprawling oasis, the new network of irrigation trenches was entirely complete. The heavy wooden wagons at the edge of the valley were fully loaded with massive sacks of life-saving grain, ready to be transported back to the starving northern capital. Sarah stood at the edge of the main reservoir, her chest rising and falling with quiet exhaustion as she watched Kaelen wash the thick dark mud from his face and arms in the crystal-clear water. The physical labor had entirely transformed him, completely stripping away the cold, arrogant facade of the king and revealing a humble, fiercely devoted partner. She felt the heavy walls around her heart finally begin to crack, just a tiny fraction, allowing a small, fragile seed of hope to take root in her chest. She took a slow step toward him, her lips parting to offer a rare, genuine word of praise for his relentless hard work. But a massive, terrifying cliffhanger suddenly shattered the peaceful evening air as a loud, frantic warning horn blew from the high northern rocky ridge, signaling that a massive, unknown threat had just breached the outer perimeter of her sanctuary, completely disrupting their quiet, hard-earned peace. The frantic warning horn that shattered the peaceful evening air was not a herald of war, but the distinct rhythmic blast of the southern perimeter sentries, signaling a sudden, violent dust squall. Sarah instantly recognized the specific pitch of the alarm. A massive wall of churning gray sand and sheer wind was rolling rapidly down the jagged mountain passes, threatening to shatter the fragile glass panes of her central greenhouse. Without a single moment of hesitation, she sprinted toward the heart of the sanctuary, her bare feet flying over the damp soil. Kaelen was immediately right behind her, his massive strides easily keeping pace with her desperate rush. The sky above them darkened into a bruised, terrifying purple as the howling wind hit the valley floor, whipping the golden wheat into a frantic, chaotic frenzy. They reached the grand wooden doors just as the first brutal gust of the storm slammed against the glass structure, causing the entire building to groan under the immense atmospheric pressure. Sarah scrambled up the wooden terrace planters, desperately trying to pull the heavy iron levers that would seal the upper ventilation shutters. But the wind was far too strong, ripping the thick hemp rope right through her bare hands and tearing a deep, painful gash across her palm. Kaelen saw her struggle and did not wait for an invitation. He vaulted over the lower planting beds, his powerful muscles straining as he reached up and grabbed the wildly swinging wooden shutter. With a raw, guttural roar of sheer physical exertion, the Alpha King used his massive strength to entirely overpower the howling southern wind, forcing the heavy wooden panel shut against the violent storm. Sarah quickly slid the iron locking bolt into place, sealing the massive greenhouse completely, just as the blinding dust squall swallowed the valley outside. The sudden transition from the deafening, chaotic roar of the storm to the thick, humid silence of the sanctuary was absolutely staggering. They stood together in the dim golden light of the enclosed greenhouse, entirely surrounded by the intoxicating fragrance of crushed jasmine and wet soil, their chests heaving in perfect synchronized rhythm. The storm raged violently against the thick glass panes above them, but inside the sanctuary, they were completely insulated, wrapped in a warm, private world of their own making. Sarah let out a long, trembling breath of relief, leaning back against the rough wooden planter. It was only then that she felt the sharp, burning sting in her right hand. She looked down to see a steady stream of bright crimson blood welling from the deep rope burn across her calloused palm, dripping slowly onto the dark, fertile soil below. Before she could even reach for a piece of linen to bind the wound, Kaelen was suddenly standing directly in front of her. His icy blue eyes were entirely focused on her bleeding hand, his massive frame completely radiating a fierce protective heat. He did not ask for permission. He reached out with infinite gentle care, taking her injured hand into his own massive dirt-stained palms. The physical contact sent a violent, electrifying shockwave straight through the fated bond, humming in their blood, completely paralyzing Sarah with its overwhelming emotional intensity. Kaelen guided her slowly toward the central stone basin, where crystal-clear aquifer water bubbled softly over smooth white river stones. He dipped a clean strip of white linen into the freezing water and gently began to wash the blood and dark mud from her palm. His massive hands that had wielded heavy broadswords and conquered massive empires, moved with a breathtaking, heartbreaking tenderness. He carefully wiped away the dirt, entirely revealing the thick, rough calluses that covered her fingers and palms. These were the very same hands he had looked at with absolute disgust 3 years ago in his glittering velvet-draped palace. Now he looked at them with profound, staggering reverence. He saw the permanent scars of her grueling labor, the blistering proof of her magnificent, unyielding survival. Kaelen slowly bowed his head, his dark, wet hair falling forward over his broad shoulders as he pressed his warm lips directly against the deepest callus on her palm. The kiss was not a demanding alpha claim. It was an absolute, humble gesture of total devotion and profound, devastating apology. Sarah felt her breath completely catch in her throat, her heart hammering a wild, erratic rhythm against her ribs. The romantic tension in the humid air hummed beautifully, wrapping around them like a thick, invisible blanket of pure electricity. Kaelen looked up at her, his icy eyes entirely vulnerable, and bare, whispering softly that he was a blind, arrogant fool for ever believing that smooth, untouched hands held more value than hands that could create life from dust. He told her that her scars were the most beautiful things he had ever seen, completely destroying his archaic definition of royalty. The deep, rumbling sincerity in his voice chipped away another massive piece of the icy walls Sarah had built around her heart. She felt a desperate, agonizing urge to step forward and bury her face in his broad chest, to let the fated bond entirely consume them both in the warm, fragrant dark. But Sarah had survived the absolute darkest depths of rejection, and she would not surrender her hard-earned peace so easily. She carefully but firmly pulled her bandaged hand back from his gentle grip, taking a small, deliberate step backward to protect her slowly healing heart. She looked up at the towering Alpha King, telling him softly but unyieldingly that one single day of sweating in the dirt did not completely erase the years of invisible torment she had endured in his capital. She demanded actions and time, not just poetic apologies in the dark. Kaelen did not look angry or rejected. He simply nodded his massive head, his eyes burning with an unshakable, fierce determination, swearing quietly that he would spend every remaining day of his life proving his worth to her. A beautiful, fragile peace settled over the greenhouse as they stood together, listening to the dying wind, but a sudden, terrifying cliffhanger shattered the quiet intimacy when the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary violently burst open, revealing a breathless southern scout who delivered the horrifying news that imperial messengers from the corrupt royal council had just arrived at the border with a massive hidden army, preparing to seize the harvest by force. The heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary violently burst open, crashing loudly against the stone walls as a breathless southern scout stumbled into the humid greenhouse. He was drenched in sweat and panting heavily, his chest heaving as he delivered the horrifying news that imperial messengers from the corrupt royal council had just arrived at the border. But they had not come alone to peacefully transport the life-saving grain. The scout reported with wide, terrified eyes that his perimeter patrols had spotted a massive hidden army of heavy northern infantry gathering just beyond the eastern ridge, preparing to seize the miraculous harvest by absolute brutal. The fragile, quiet peace that had just begun to bloom between Sarah and Kaelen was instantly and completely shattered. Sarah stood perfectly still in the warm golden light of the greenhouse, her mind immediately shifting from the tender vulnerability of the moment back to the cold, sharp, analytical reality of survival. She did not panic. She simply processed the tactical information with the brilliant, calculating mind of a true sovereign, analyzing the exact distance from the eastern ridge to her primary irrigation reservoirs. Kaelen felt a massive surge of dark, violent rage completely overtake his senses. His icy blue eyes darkened into a terrifying stormy gray, his massive chest heaving with the sheer agonizing realization of what was happening. The royal council, the very aristocrats he had protected and enriched for his entire reign, had completely betrayed him. They had realized that their Alpha King was willing to bow to a disgraced Omega, and rather than accept salvation on her terms, they had chosen absolute treason. They intended to storm the Hidden Valley, slaughter the innocent southern workers, and claim the breathtaking agricultural oasis as their own property, refusing to ever recognize the sovereignty of the woman they had cast into the dirt. Kaelen felt a profound, crushing shame, realizing that the toxic, arrogant culture he had cultivated in his capital had directly created this monstrous, greedy betrayal. He looked at Sarah, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, as he swore on his very life that he would never let his corrupt army touch a single blade of her wheat. Sarah did not wait for him to formulate a traditional military strategy. She completely ignored the throbbing pain in her bandaged hand and walked purposefully out of the greenhouse, striding directly into the cool evening air. Kaelen followed her, his massive bare feet hitting the damp earth as they made their way toward the outer border of the valley where the imperial messengers were currently waiting. The air was incredibly tense-heavy with the terrifying promise of impending violence. When they reached the perimeter, they found 3 high-ranking council emissaries sitting atop grand white horses, their fine velvet robes entirely out of place in the rugged southern landscape. They looked down at the southern refugees with expressions of absolute undisguised disgust, completely unaware that their supposedly missing Alpha King was walking right toward them, entirely covered in dark mud and wearing a simple coarse linen tunic. The lead emissary, a vain, arrogant duke who had laughed the loudest at Sarah during her mating ceremony, sneered down at her. He spoke with a sickeningly sweet tone of false authority, completely ignoring the treaty she had signed. He declared loudly that the Royal Council was officially seizing the southern lands by eminent domain, claiming that a banished weak Omega had absolutely no legal right to hoard the kingdom's resources while the capital starved. He demanded that she surrender the grain silos immediately and submit to the chains of the Royal Guard or face the absolute wrath of the northern military. Sarah stood her ground, her posture impeccably straight and her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding power. She told the arrogant duke calmly that the southern lands were an independent sovereign nation, and his authority meant absolutely nothing in her valley. The duke laughed, a cruel, harsh sound that echoed through the quiet fields, declaring that her imaginary crown would not stop 1,000 armored soldiers from taking whatever they pleased. It was then that Kaelen finally stepped out from the shadows of the towering wheat directly into the pale moonlight. He did not wear his massive iron chestplate or his heavy velvet cape, but the sheer terrifying aura of his alpha dominance completely suffocated the air around them. The 3 imperial emissaries froze instantly, their cruel laughter dying completely in their throats as they stared in absolute horrifying shock at their undefeated king. Kaelen looked up at the trembling duke, his icy blue eyes completely devoid of any mercy or recognition. He spoke with a quiet, deadly, absolute authority, declaring that the Royal Council had committed high treason against their true sovereign and against the independent Queen of the Harvest. He informed the terrified messengers that any northern soldier who dared to step foot into the valley would face the absolute unrestrained wrath of their own Alpha King. The Duke scrambled desperately to formulate an excuse, stammering wildly that they had assumed the king was dead and they were merely acting to save the empire. But the pathetic lies fell entirely on deaf ears. Kaelen knew exactly what they were. They were parasites feeding on the absolute worst vanities of his old world, and he was entirely ready to burn that old world to the ground to protect the brilliant woman standing beside him. He ordered the emissaries to turn their horses around and ride back to their hidden army with a final absolute warning. But the arrogant duke, realizing that the king had completely abandoned his own court for a banished Omega, suddenly dropped his cowardly facade. His face twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl as he spurred his massive white horse backward. A massive, terrifying cliffhanger hung in the heavy night air as the duke laughed one last desperate time, revealing a horrifying truth. He screamed into the darkness that the king's warning was entirely too late because the hidden army was not waiting for tomorrow morning. He revealed with a wicked, triumphant sneer that heavily armed saboteurs had already slipped past the border defenses under the cover of the dust storm and were currently making their way toward the primary water reservoir, completely prepared to poison the lifeblood of the entire valley before the sun even dared to rise. The horrifying revelation from the fleeing duke hung in the heavy night air for only a fraction of a second before Sarah sprang into action. She did not waste precious time screaming in panic. Her brilliant analytical mind instantly calculated the topography of her vast sanctuary, pinpointing the absolute most vulnerable intersection of her irrigation network. The primary gravity basin, located at the highest elevation of the northern ridge, fed every single trench and aqueduct in the If the saboteurs managed to introduce a toxic agent into that specific reservoir, the poisoned water would cascade through the intricate system, entirely eradicating 3 years of miraculous botanical engineering in hours. Without waiting for Kaelen, she hiked up the hem of her coarse linen dress and sprinted wildly into the dark, rugged foothills, her bare, callous feet flying over the sharp rocks with desperate agility. Kaelen was immediately right behind her, his powerful strides easily eating up the distance, but the rugged, winding paths were designed by Sarah, and she moved through the dark terrain like a phantom of the earth itself. The pale silver moonlight filtered through the sparse canopy of the resilient scrub trees, illuminating the final steep incline leading to the massive stone reservoir. As Sarah crested the rocky ridge, her breath caught violently in her throat. Standing at the edge of the deep, crystal-clear basin were 5 heavily cloaked figures. They were Royal Council saboteurs moving with a sinister, quiet urgency. One of the dark figures was unscrewing the heavy iron cap of a massive glass vial containing a thick, foul-smelling black liquid that radiated an unnatural toxic heat. They were mere seconds away from dumping the lethal substance directly into the pristine drinking water of the oasis. Sarah did not have a sword, but she possessed a profound mastery over the environment she had built. She realized instantly she could not overpower 5 trained military operatives, but she could manipulate the flow of the water. She sprinted quietly along the elevated stone ridge until she reached a heavy wooden release wheel of the secondary emergency spillway. With a fierce burst of adrenaline, she grabbed the rough wooden spokes and threw her entire body weight backward, violently spinning the wheel. The massive iron gears groaned loudly in the quiet night as the emergency gate dropped, shutting off the primary basin from the vulnerable valley network. The sudden mechanical grinding alerted the saboteurs to her presence. They spun around, dropping the heavy glass vial onto the stone edge where it shattered, harmlessly spilling the toxic black liquid onto the dry dirt instead of into the precious water supply. The lead saboteur let out a furious curse, drawing a long, gleaming steel blade from beneath his dark cloak. Realizing their sinister mission had been thwarted by a single unarmed woman, the 5 operatives immediately turned their violent wrath towards Sarah. They began to advance quickly across the narrow stone walkway, their heavy military boots echoing menacingly, entirely trapping her against the steep edge of the deep reservoir. Sarah stood perfectly still, her back pressed against the cold stone pillar, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She did not cower. She looked at the approaching assassins with unyielding defiance, her hazel eyes blazing with the magnificent power of a true queen, entirely willing to sacrifice herself to protect the sacred soil. The lead saboteur raised his gleaming blade, preparing to strike her down in the name of the corrupt northern aristocracy. But before the heavy steel blade could begin its descent, a terrifying roar of pure alpha fury shattered the night. Kaelen erupted over the rocky ridge like a devastating force of nature. He had no armor, no shield, and no royal broadsword. He was armed with nothing but a rusted iron shovel and the devastating wrath of a mate protecting his equal. He launched his massive frame through the air, landing directly between Sarah and the armed assassins with a heavy earth-shaking impact. The sheer terrifying aura of his dominance slammed into the saboteurs, entirely paralyzing them with instinctual dread. The Alpha King did not hesitate for a single microsecond. He swung the heavy iron shovel with breathtaking, calculated precision, disarming the lead assassin with a shattering blow to his wrist before driving the wooden handle directly into the chest of the second attacker, sending him flying backward. The remaining 3 operatives, realizing they were facing the supreme military commander of their own empire, entirely lost their nerve. But Kaelen offered no mercy to men who had tried to poison an innocent valley. He moved with fluid, terrifying grace, his massive muscles rippling under his sweat-drenched tunic, as he systematically neutralized the treacherous threat entirely without resorting to bloody slaughter. He used their own momentum against them, breaking their weapons and rendering them unconscious with swift, precise blows, leaving the 5 saboteurs groaning on the hard stone ground. The violent encounter was over in a matter of breathless seconds. Kaelen dropped the heavy rusted shovel, turning immediately towards Sarah, his chest heaving violently, his icy blue eyes completely wild with protective terror. He reached out, grabbing her shoulders, pulling her tightly against his broad chest in a sudden, desperate embrace, completely forgetting all royal decorum. Sarah felt the frantic, erratic beating of his heart pressing directly against her own, her cheek resting against his damp, sweat-soaked tunic. For the very first time, she did not pull away. She allowed herself to lean into his immense protective strength, her trembling arms slowly wrapping around his waist, her fingers gripping the coarse linen of his shirt. The fated bond hummed a beautiful, triumphant melody, wrapping them in an absolute cocoon of shared survival and deepening trust. He had fought for her not out of arrogant pride, but out of absolute fierce devotion. They stood together in the pale silver moonlight, catching their breath, the immediate sinister threat completely neutralized by her brilliant intellect and his massive strength. But their quiet moment of profound emotional connection was suddenly violently cut short. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to crack over the distant, jagged eastern horizon, a massive, terrifying sound began to vibrate through the solid stone beneath their bare feet. It was the rhythmic, deafening march of thousands of heavy iron boots. Sarah and Kaelen slowly pulled apart, turning toward the rising sun as a massive, terrifying cliffhanger revealed itself. The entire sprawling eastern ridge was suddenly completely covered by the towering, imposing silhouettes of the main Northern Army, their heavy steel armor gleaming menacingly in the morning light, entirely prepared to obliterate the beautiful, peaceful world Sarah had created. The terrifying rhythmic thunder of 10,000 heavy iron boots, marching in perfect synchronized unison, shook the very foundation of the southern ridge. Sarah stood at the edge of the high stone reservoir, her breath perfectly steady as she looked out over the massive, sprawling eastern horizon. The corrupt Northern Council had spared absolutely no expense in their treacherous quest for power. A vast, intimidating sea of heavily armored infantry and massive siege engines slowly crested the rocky hills, their polished steel breastplates and sharp, gleaming halberds catching the harsh, blinding light of the early morning sun. It was the greatest military force the continent had ever seen, an unstoppable, brutal machine of death that had decimated rival empires for centuries. Kaelen stepped forward to stand directly beside her, his massive fists clenching tightly at his sides. Every single instinct forged by decades of warfare screamed in his alpha blood to charge forward to protect his mate with raw, violent force. But he was just one unarmed man against an empire. He looked down at Sarah, his voice a low, desperate rumble, acknowledging that he could not fight 1,000 men alone and urging her to evacuate the sanctuary while he held the narrow pass with his own life. Sarah did not look at him with fear or despair. She turned her fierce hazel eyes toward the towering Alpha King, a profound, confident, and breathtakingly beautiful smile, slowly touching her lips. She told him with a voice as calm and unyielding as the ancient bedrock beneath their feet that they would not run, and he would not sacrifice his life in a meaningless, bloody battle. She explained that the arrogant northern generals only understood the brutal geometry of swords and shields, completely ignoring the complex absolute science of the earth. They were marching their heavy infantry directly into the shallow outer basin, a wide, expansive depression that Sarah had deliberately left unplanted. It was a vast, dry plain composed entirely of loose southern clay and fine sand, completely porous and highly reactive to sudden intense moisture. She reached out and grabbed his large dirt-stained hand, pulling him away from the rocky ledge and guiding him rapidly toward the massive wooden control wheel of the primary eastern aqueduct, entirely ignoring the deafening roar of the approaching army. The northern infantry began their slow, arrogant descent into the valley, entirely confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority. The corrupt council generals riding atop their heavily armored warhorses sneered at the seemingly undefended agricultural oasis, entirely unaware that they were marching directly into a brilliant botanical trap. Sarah climbed onto the elevated wooden platform overlooking the massive water gates, her mind calculating the exact, precise velocity and trajectory of the subterranean pressure. She waited with agonizing, terrifying patience as the front lines of the enemy army crossed the invisible threshold of the outer basin, their heavy metal boots sinking slightly into the dry, deceptive dust. The tension in the morning air was suffocatingly thick, the fated bond humming wildly in his chest. As Kaelen stood by the massive iron release levers, entirely surrendering his legendary military command to her superior botanical intellect, he watched her profile illuminated by the rising sun, waiting for the exact, absolute moment. When the entire main body of the heavy infantry was completely committed to the center of the outer basin, Sarah finally raised her right hand. With a sharp, decisive downward motion, she gave the absolute command. Kaelen roared with raw physical exertion, violently pulling the heavy rusted levers backward with all his massive strength. The massive wooden sluice gates groaned in protest before completely giving way, unleashing a terrifying localized deluge. It was not a destructive, chaotic wave, but a precisely calculated, rapid saturation. Millions of gallons of pressurized underground water surged through the specialized outer trenches, instantly flooding the dry, porous basin from beneath. The reaction was absolutely instantaneous. The dry, loose clay transformed violently into a deep, thick, inescapable mire of heavy southern mud. The majestic, terrifying northern army was completely halted in a matter of breathless seconds. The heavy steel armor that the soldiers relied upon for absolute invincibility suddenly became their greatest weakness. The massive weight of their iron breastplates and thick metal boots dragged them violently down into the suffocating mud, sinking them instantly up to their waists in the thick, clinging earth. The armored warhorses panicked, completely unable to find a solid footing, their riders thrown harmlessly into the soft, wet mire. The grand siege engines, the massive wooden catapults, and iron battering rams sank immediately into the soft ground, their heavy wooden wheels entirely swallowed by the earth, rendering them completely useless. The arrogant northern generals screamed frantic, chaotic orders, But their voices were entirely drowned out by the sheer panic of an army, entirely defeated without a single sword being drawn or a single drop of blood being spilled. Sarah stood on the high wooden platform watching the greatest military force in the world, completely neutralized by her brilliant mind and the raw, unyielding power of nature. She had turned the earth itself into her ultimate undisputed weapon. Kaelen let go of the iron levers, his chest heaving as he walked slowly to the edge of the platform, completely staggered by the sheer magnitude of her victory. He had spent his entire life studying the art of war, completely blind to the fact that true ultimate power lay in understanding the delicate balance of life. He looked down at the trapped, frustrated army and then turned slowly to look at the magnificent woman standing beside him. The immediate physical threat was entirely neutralized, but a massive, profound emotional cliffhanger hung in the golden morning air as the Alpha King realized that protecting this incredible queen was no longer enough. He needed to completely, irrevocably bind his soul to hers, to formally declare his absolute eternal submission to her brilliant mind before the eyes of the entire world. The chaotic, desperate screams of the trapped northern army echoed uselessly across the submerged basin. 10,000 heavily armored soldiers struggled against the thick, clinging mud, their grand imperial conquest entirely reduced to a humiliating, frantic display of absolute helplessness. Sarah stood on the elevated wooden platform, her chest rising and falling in a steady, calm rhythm as the cool morning wind swept through her dark hair. She had achieved the absolute impossible, entirely dismantling the greatest military force in the known world, not with violence, but with an intimate, profound understanding of the earth. She felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settling over her soul, a fierce, triumphant validation of every single tear she had shed in the dark corners of the royal gardens years ago. But before she could turn to issue the final orders to her southern sentries, she felt a massive, warm presence step entirely into her personal space. Kaelen stood directly beside her, his massive frame radiating an intoxicating, overwhelming heat that made the fated bond in her blood roar with a sudden, wild demand. He did not look out at his defeated army. His icy blue eyes were completely, utterly fixated on her, his gaze burning with a staggering intensity that completely stole the breath from her lungs. The mighty Alpha King, the supreme commander who had just watched his own military machine sink into the dirt, felt absolutely no anger or betrayal. He felt only a profound, earth-shattering reverence. He reached out his large, dirt-stained hands, trembling slightly as he gently grasped her slender fingers. He did not issue a royal command. He simply asked her in a voice vibrating with absolute raw emotion to walk with him down into the fields, to stand before the eyes of the old world and finalize the destiny they had been running from for 3 long years. Sarah felt a beautiful, terrifying tremor run through her spine as she looked up into his completely vulnerable eyes. She saw no trace of the arrogant, cruel boy who had mocked her at the grand mating ceremony. She saw only a deeply humbled, fiercely devoted man who had bled in the mud to protect her sanctuary. She slowly knotted her fingers, tightening around his massive hand, entirely surrendering to the overwhelming pull of their shared soul. Together, they walked slowly down the wooden steps, leaving the high platform and stepping directly into the center of the lush golden wheat fields. They stood at the very edge of the flooded basin, perfectly visible to the thousands of trapped, frantic soldiers and the humiliated, screaming generals. The sheer cinematic power of the moment was absolutely breathtaking. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden halo around them, illuminating the dark, fertile soil clinging to their simple linen clothes and the raw, unyielding strength in their intertwined hands. Kaelen did not draw a sword to demand the loyalty of his troops. He turned entirely towards Sarah, his massive, broad shoulders completely ignoring the audience of 10,000 men. He slowly lowered himself down onto one knee, right in the damp southern earth, pressing her calloused hand directly against the heavy beating of his heart. His voice, deep and resonant, boomed across the silent fields, entirely silencing the frantic struggles of the trapped army. He spoke not to his soldiers, but directly to her, declaring before the moon goddess and the entire world that he completely, irrevocably rejected the toxic vanity of the northern court. He loudly renounced the archaic laws that valued superficial beauty over brilliant intellect, completely shattering the ancient traditions of his own empire. He swore his life, his royal crown, and his eternal soul to the soil and to the magnificent genius of the woman standing before him. Sarah felt tears of profound, overwhelming joy finally spill over her dark eyelashes, entirely washing away the last lingering shadows of her past trauma. She looked down at the massive Alpha King kneeling in the dirt, pledging his absolute devotion, not as a conquering master, but as a fiercely loyal equal. The fated bond that had been violently severed 3 years ago suddenly snapped back together with an agonizing, beautiful force. It was a completely spiritual phenomenon, a rushing torrent of pure golden energy that surged violently through their veins, entirely merging their separate souls into one magnificent, unbreakable. She felt his immense physical strength, his protective fury, and his profound, unending remorse flooding into her mind, while he felt her brilliant intellect, her unyielding resilience, and her deep nurturing warmth pouring into his heart. She reached down with her free hand, gently cupping his rough, bearded cheek, and slowly guided him to stand. As he rose to his full, massive height, their eyes locked in absolute, perfect understanding. He leaned down, wrapping his strong arms entirely around her waist, and pressed his warm lips against hers in a breathtaking, slow burn kiss that sealed their eternal bond. It was a kiss that tasted of tears, wet earth, and absolute triumphant survival. The trapped army watched in completely stunned silence, entirely mesmerized by the overwhelming supernatural resonance of their completed union. But the profound romantic piece of the ritual was only a brief, beautiful. Sarah slowly pulled away from his lips, her hazel eyes darkening with a sudden sharp resolve as a massive heavy cliffhanger settled over the golden fields. They had successfully defended the southern oasis and secured their eternal bond, but to truly save the starving innocent commoners and permanently dismantle the corrupt High Council, they could not simply remain in their hidden paradise. They would have to load the massive grain wagons, march directly back into the hostile dying capital, and confront the venomous aristocracy on their own grand marble floors, completely prepared to tear down the very foundations of the old world. The massive convoy of heavy wooden wagons rumbled loudly against the cracked cobblestones of the dying northern capital. Sarah sat completely upright on the lead wagon, her posture unbroken and fierce, as she rode directly through the towering iron gates of the city. Beside her, Kaelen rode his massive black warhorse, not as a returning conqueror, but as a fiercely devoted guardian, entirely focused on protecting his queen. The contrast between the returning convoy and the devastated capital was absolute. The grand marble fountains were completely dry, filled with nothing but gray dust. The once vibrant streets were lined with gaunt, starving commoners whose hollow eyes widened in absolute shock as they stared at the seemingly endless procession of overflowing grain sacks and lush green produce. The rich, intoxicating scent of fresh wheat and damp earth entirely overwhelmed the suffocating smell of despair that had choked the city for 3 days. Sarah looked down at the desperate, crying faces of the citizens, feeling a profound, heavy ache in her chest. But she knew that simply handing out bread would not permanently cure the deep systemic rot of the empire. She had to completely excise the venomous aristocratic disease that had caused the famine in the first place. The convoy finally came to a halt in the grand royal courtyard, directly before the towering, polished doors of the central palace. The heavy golden doors swung violently open, revealing the surviving members of the corrupt High Council. The vain aristocrats had dressed in their finest heavy velvet robes and glittering diamond necklaces, desperately attempting to project a false aura of absolute authority despite their gaunt, hollow cheeks. The arrogant duke who had fled the southern basin stepped forward, his face twisted in a desperate sneer. He looked at Kaelen, expecting the Alpha King to apologize for his temporary madness and hand over the precious harvest to the royal treasury. The Duke commanded the city guards to immediately seize the wooden wagons, declaring loudly that the High Council would carefully ration the food to the noble houses first to ensure the stability of the grand government. He entirely ignored Sarah, treating her as nothing more than an invisible peasant who had simply transported the goods. But Kaelen did not order his guards to move. He sat completely motionless on his massive warhorse, his icy blue eyes staring at the pathetic, trembling council with absolute unyielding disgust. He remained entirely silent, allowing the brilliant woman beside him to take the absolute center stage. Sarah gracefully stepped down from the heavy wooden wagon, her simple, coarse linen dress standing in stark, beautiful contrast to the ridiculous heavy velvet of the court. She did not raise her voice to a frantic scream, nor did she beg for their respect. She walked slowly up the wide marble steps, her bare, callous feet leaving dark smudges of rich southern soil entirely staining the immaculate, pristine white stone. She stopped directly in front of the arrogant duke, her sharp hazel eyes cutting through his pathetic facade with terrifying absolute. Sarah began to speak, her voice carrying a calm, cool authority that completely echoed across the silent, crowded courtyard. She did not use emotional pleas or political threats. She used absolute, undeniable truth. She systematically, publicly dismantled the council, exposing their profound, terrifying incompetence to the thousands of starving commoners who had gathered behind the wagons. She detailed exactly how the aristocrats had deliberately diverted the natural northern rivers to power their superficial decorative fountains, entirely draining the fragile water tables. She explained the complex botanical reality of the soil, revealing that their obsession with clearing the protective ancient forests to build sprawling, empty palaces had directly caused the catastrophic topsoil erosion that brought the drought. She presented the cold, hard agricultural facts, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the famine was not a sudden, cruel curse from the moon goddess, but the direct catastrophic result of aristocratic vanity and extreme systemic greed. The arrogant duke tried desperately to interrupt her, stammering wildly about ancient bloodlines and divine royal rights, but his weak voice was completely drowned out by the sheer crushing weight of her intellect. Sarah turned her gaze toward the starving commoners, her voice ringing with a fierce, empowering resonance, as she declared that true power did not come from a heavy gold crown or a pure bloodline. True power came from the ability to nurture the earth, to understand the science of survival, and to feed the innocent. The gathered citizens, who had suffered in absolute silent agony for years, listened to her brilliant words with a sudden terrifying awakening. The hollow despair in their sunken eyes was instantly replaced by a burning, furious clarity. They slowly turned their gazes toward the terrified counselors, entirely realizing that the velvet-draped nobles had literally starved them to death to preserve their own superficial beauty. The High Council shrank backward under the sudden terrifying weight of the public fury, their absolute authority completely shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The arrogant duke fell to his knees on the polished marble, weeping pathetic, useless tears as his grand political empire collapsed entirely. Sarah had won the greatest victory in the history of the Northern Kingdom without spilling a single drop of blood, simply by exposing the dark, rotting truth to the light. The immediate threat of the corrupt council was permanently eradicated, but a massive, heavy cliffhanger hung in the tense, dusty air as Sarah looked past the weeping aristocrats and directly at the towering, empty throne inside the grand hall, completely realizing that simply destroying the old regime was entirely not enough. If she wanted to ensure that no child would ever starve for the sake of aristocratic vanity again, she would have to completely rewrite the ancient laws of the realm from the ground up, entirely overturning centuries of toxic tradition. The grand marble hall of the royal palace, which had once echoed with the cruel, mocking laughter of the high aristocracy, now stood entirely silent under the immense, crushing weight of true revolutionary change. Sarah walked slowly past the weeping duke and stepped across the massive threshold of the throne room. The air inside was completely stagnant, smelling of old dust and desperate vanity. At the far end of the cavernous room sat the grand royal throne, a massive, terrifying structure forged from solid northern iron and draped in heavy, dark velvet. For centuries, that chair had symbolized absolute brutal dominance, representing a system that viewed brute military strength as the only valid currency of power and treated gentle omegas as nothing more than beautiful, disposable property. Sarah stopped a few feet away from the imposing structure, her heart beating a steady, calm rhythm in her chest. She remembered exactly how invisible she had felt standing in this very room 3 years ago, completely suffocated by the rigid, archaic caste system that told her she was entirely worthless because she loved the soil more than the ballroom. She was absolutely determined to ensure that no child of the empire would ever feel that agonizing, crushing invisibility ever again. She did not sit on the Iron Throne. She turned her back to it, completely rejecting the heavy, dark legacy it represented, and faced the gathering crowd of commoners, soldiers, and terrified remaining aristocrats who had cautiously followed her into the hall. She reached into the deep pockets of her coarse linen apron and pulled out a thick stack of woven parchment entirely covered in the complex, brilliant schematics and careful handwriting she had developed in the southern oasis. She did not ask the High Council for their permission or consult the ancient royal texts. She simply began to read her new decrees, aloud, her voice ringing with a clear, unyielding, absolute authority that completely shattered the fragile, archaic foundations of the old world. Her very first decree entirely abolished the ancient, rigid caste system that had segregated the kingdom for generations. She declared loudly that omegas were no longer the legal property of their alphas, completely stripping away the archaic laws that forbade them from receiving formal education or holding political office. From this day forward, omegas would be permitted to study advanced botanical sciences, to own vast tracts of agricultural land, and to hold absolute governing power over their own independent lives. The terrified murmurs of the remaining conservative nobles instantly filled the hall, completely scandalized by the sheer revolutionary audacity of her decrees. An elderly count, trembling in his heavy silk robes, dared to step forward, sputtering desperately that these radical changes would completely destroy the natural order of the kingdom and bring absolute chaos to the empire. He demanded to know who would enforce such unnatural laws, completely expecting the Alpha King to finally step forward and put an end to this Omega rebellion. But Kaelen did not silence her. He stepped entirely into the light, his massive frame completely dwarfing the trembling count. He did not draw a sword, but the sheer terrifying aura of his alpha dominance flooded the grand hall, instantly suffocating the arrogant protests of the old guard. He spoke with a deep, rumbling, absolute finality, declaring that he was no longer the supreme military master of a dying empire, but the fiercely devoted sword of the Harvest Queen. He swore an unbreakable public oath to enforce every single word of her brilliant decrees, entirely pledging the full terrifying might of the northern military to protect the new world order she was building. Kaelen turned his icy blue eyes toward the remaining counselors, his voice a low, dangerous growl, as he formally officially stripped them of their vast ancestral lands and immense hoarded wealth. He declared that their grand empty palaces would be completely dismantled, their polished stones used to build massive public agricultural academies, where children of every rank could learn the profound science of the earth. He ordered the counselors to immediately trade their heavy velvet robes for coarse linen tunics, completely banishing them to the outer fields to learn exactly how to sweat in the dirt for their daily bread, just as he had done. The sheer absolute poetic justice of his commands resonated beautifully through the grand hall, prompting a sudden massive wave of cheering from the starving commoners. The people did not fear their massive king. They completely revered the magnificent unified balance of his raw physical power and her brilliant nurturing intellect. Sarah watched Kaelen dismantle the corrupt aristocracy with a profound, soaring joy completely filling her healing heart. The fated bond between them hummed with a bright golden resonance, entirely solidifying their absolute partnership. They had successfully destroyed the toxic foundations of the past and laid the brilliant, strong groundwork for a thriving, equal future. The complex, intricate laws of her new society were firmly established, providing a clear, radiant path for the absolute survival and prosperity of the empire. But as the deafening cheers of the commoners slowly began to fade into a reverent, emotional silence, a heavy, sudden realization settled over the grand hall. The systemic political revolution was entirely complete, but the absolute spiritual transition of power had not yet been formally recognized. The high priest of the royal court, a frail, nervous man carrying a heavy velvet cushion, slowly approached them from the dark shadows of the altar. Resting on the cushion was the ancient traditional crown of the queen consort, a massive, suffocating ring of heavy dead gold covered in cold, unfeeling diamonds. A massive cliffhanger hung in the tense, dusty air as Sarah stared down at the heavy, ancient crown, completely realizing that placing that cold, dead metal upon her head would entirely betray everything she had just fought so desperately to build. The high priest stood trembling before her, holding the heavy velvet cushion out with frail, shaking hands. Resting upon the rich red fabric was the ancient traditional crown of the queen consort, a massive, imposing ring of thick, dead gold encrusted with cold, unfeeling diamonds. For centuries, that heavy metal had been placed upon the heads of delicate, fragile omegas, who were expected to sit silently in the shadows of their alpha kings, serving as nothing more than beautiful, useless ornaments. Sarah stared down at the glittering artifact, feeling absolutely no desire to let that suffocating weight rest upon her brow. The gold was mined from the deep, dark veins of the earth, completely stripped of all life and forged in the fires of aristocratic vanity. To wear it would be to accept the toxic, heavy legacy of the very court she had just completely dismantled. She looked up at the nervous high priest, her hazel eyes entirely calm, but fiercely unyielding. She gently but firmly reached out and pushed the velvet cushion away, entirely rejecting the ancient, glittering symbol of royal oppression. A collective gasp of absolute pure shock rippled through the grand marble hall as the remaining nobility watched a banished Omega completely refuse the highest honor the Northern Kingdom could bestow. Sarah turned her back on the trembling priest and looked directly at Kaelen. The mighty Alpha King did not look surprised or offended by her breathtaking audacity. Instead, a profound, brilliant smile slowly spread across his handsome face, completely illuminating his icy blue eyes with a fierce, soaring pride. He knew her absolute soul far too well to ever believe she would want a dead cold metal resting upon her head. He had completely anticipated this exact beautiful rebellion. Kaelen reached beneath the heavy folds of his simple, coarse linen tunic and brought forth a completely different kind of crown entirely hidden from the court until this exact perfect moment. It was not forged by royal blacksmiths in suffocating dark armories, but woven with profound, infinite care by his own massive, calloused hands during the quiet, starry nights in the southern oasis. It was a magnificent, breathtaking crown of pure living life. Kaelen had meticulously braided the very first golden stalks of the miraculous drought-resistant wheat, intertwining them with vibrant living emerald vines pulled directly from her massive glass sanctuary. The resilient leaves were beautifully dusted with a fine layer of hardened natural amber resin that caught the light of the grand hall, shimmering and sparkling far brighter than any cold, unfeeling diamond ever could. It smelled intoxicatingly of wet, fertile soil, blooming jasmine, and absolute triumphant survival. It was the ultimate, perfect symbol of her magnificent journey, representing the incredible life she had pulled from the dry, cracked earth and the profound agricultural genius that had saved their dying world. Sarah felt a massive, overwhelming wave of pure emotion rise in her chest, completely stealing the breath from her lungs. She looked at the woven crown of wheat and vines, and then up into the deeply devoted eyes of the powerful Alpha who had painstakingly crafted it. He had taken the very elements she loved most in the world and shaped them into a profound, undeniable declaration of his absolute, eternal submission to her brilliant mind. She did not want to be crowned in the dark, suffocating shadows of the old marble throne room. She reached out and gently took his massive rough hand, pulling him away from the heavy iron throne and leading him back out through the grand massive doors directly into the bright, blinding sunlight of the royal courtyard. The thousands of starving commoners and exhausted soldiers who had gathered outside parted respectfully, creating a wide, clear path for them. Sarah stood at the top of the grand marble steps, the warm northern sun beating down upon her sun-kissed skin and her simple linen dress. The courtyard was completely silent, entirely captivated by the breathtaking cinematic beauty of the moment. Kaelen stepped up to stand directly behind her, his massive frame providing an absolute unbreakable wall of fierce protection. He did not ask the high priest to perform the sacred rites. He took the absolute supreme authority upon himself, acting not as a conquering king, but as her fiercely devoted equal. He slowly raised the magnificent woven crown of golden wheat and emerald vines, lifting it high into the bright sunlit air for the entire desperate kingdom to witness. His deep, resonant voice echoed with a profound earth-shattering power across the silent, vast courtyard, completely declaring that the old world of vanity and cruelty was entirely, permanently dead. He proclaimed that from this absolute moment forward, the empire would no longer worship the cold, dead gold of the past, but the warm, living soil of the future. With infinite, breathtaking gentleness, Kaelen slowly lowered the beautiful woven crown, placing it perfectly upon her dark hair. The moment the living crown settled upon her brow, a sudden incredible rush of cool wind swept through the grand courtyard, carrying the intoxicating heavy scent of incoming rain. It was as if the moon goddess herself was entirely validating her magnificent, triumphant return, completely blessing the new equitable world she had forged. The silence of the courtyard shattered instantly. 10,000 voices erupted into a massive, deafening roar of absolute pure jubilation. The commoners, the soldiers, and even the newly humbled aristocrats fell to their knees on the hard cobblestones, bowing deeply in profound, staggering reverence. They were not bowing out of sheer, terrified obligation to a brutal conqueror. They were bowing out of absolute, genuine love and overwhelming gratitude to the brilliant, resilient woman who had fed their starving children and pulled their civilization back from the absolute brink of death. Sarah stood at the top of the steps, the harvest queen in all her magnificent, unyielding glory, watching the people who had once laughed at her soil-stained hands, now weeping with joy at her feet. She had completely, irrevocably won. But as the deafening cheers echoed into the darkening, stormy sky, a beautiful final cliffhanger settled gently over the majestic scene, because the absolute true measure of her magnificent reign would not be judged by the glory of this single golden afternoon, but by the vast living legacy she would leave behind for the countless generations completely waiting to bloom in the years to come. 10 vibrant, incredibly prosperous years had passed since the heavy golden crown was publicly rejected in the grand marble courtyard. The majestic northern capital was now entirely unrecognizable, completely transformed from a suffocating monument of rigid aristocratic vanity into a magnificent, sprawling testament to life equality and natural abundance. Where the towering dark palaces and empty decorative courtyards of the corrupt High Council had once stood, the Grand Botanical Academy now stretched proudly toward the clear blue sky. Built entirely from the repurposed, polished stones of the dismantled noble estates, the academy was the bustling, thriving heart of the newly unified empire. The air in the capital no longer smelled of old dust, expensive perfumes, and desperate fear. Instead, it was endlessly rich and intoxicating, filled with the heavy, beautiful fragrance of blooming southern jasmine, wet, fertile soil, and the sweet, undeniable promise of a permanent, bountiful harvest. The rigid, archaic caste laws that had once kept the kingdom completely segregated and starving were nothing more than a dark, distant memory, completely erased by the brilliant mind of one unyielding Omega. Sarah stood on the wide sunlit balcony of the main instructional conservatory, her rough, calloused hands resting gently on the beautifully carved wooden railing. She wore a simple, elegant, coarse linen dress, her thick, dark hair woven with a few fresh emerald vines, completely rejecting the heavy, suffocating velvet that the old queens had been forced to endure. Her sharp hazel eyes, now completely free of the invisible, agonizing shadows that had haunted her youth, looked out over the sprawling, meticulously organized instructional fields. Below her, hundreds of young wolves of every single rank worked side by side in the dark, damp mud, entirely stripped of any societal prejudice. Powerful young alphas, who in the old ruined world would have been handed heavy steel swords and taught only the brutal, bloody geometry of war, were now meticulously learning the delicate, profound art of crossbreeding drought-resistant seeds. Beside them, bright-eyed, brilliant Omegas who would have once been sold off as silent, fragile ornaments were confidently calculating complex gravity, fed irrigation algorithms, and managing vast, vital agricultural tracts. The earth was no longer a place of lowly servitude or peasant punishment. It was the ultimate, undisputed classroom of true sovereign power and absolute intellectual triumph. In the very center of the golden instructional fields, covered completely in dark, rich mud from head to toe, were two small, wildly energetic figures. Sarah's twin pups, a fiercely protective young alpha boy and a brilliantly intuitive omega girl, were laughing uproariously as they chased a shimmering blue garden beetle through the tall swaying gold. They did not know a world of starvation, brutal political betrayal, or cruel aristocratic mockery. They knew only the profound absolute love of a family completely rooted in the unyielding strength of the earth. They were the ultimate living embodiment of the New World children, entirely free to bloom exactly as the moon goddess had intended. A deep, familiar rumble of warm, genuine laughter echoed from the open wooden doors behind her. Kaelen stepped out onto the sunlit balcony, his massive frame completely radiating a fierce, peaceful warmth that instantly made the fated bond in her blood hum with a beautiful, triumphant. The great Alpha King still possessed the terrifying raw physical strength to completely crush rival empires, but his massive, heavily scarred hands were now completely and eternally devoted to nurturing life. He wore a simple linen tunic, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his muscular forearms, still lightly dusted with the morning soil from his own personal work in the eastern reservoir. He walked up behind her and wrapped his strong, heavy arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his broad, solid chest, and rested his chin gently on the top of her head. Kaelen pressed a tender, lingering kiss into her dark hair, his deep, resonant voice vibrating against her spine as he watched their pups wrestling happily in the dirt. He whispered softly that the future rulers of the empire were going to need a very long, very thorough scrubbing in the hot springs before they were allowed anywhere near the dinner table. Sarah leaned entirely into his immense protective strength, her callous fingers reaching up to gently trace the rough, faded scars on his large hands, the permanent, beautiful proof of the day he had willingly bled in the mud to win her trust and protect her sanctuary. She smiled, a profound, earth-shattering joy completely filling her soul, and whispered back that a little dirt was exactly what made their roots grow strong. She had started her journey as a discarded broken seed buried in the absolute darkest depths of royal rejection, completely invisible to a cruel, superficial world that only valued empty gold. But in the quiet, unforgiving shadows of the blighted lands, she had entirely refused to wither and die. She had taken the immense pain, the crushing isolation, and the harsh burning elements, and she had miraculously bloomed, ultimately saving the very empire that had foolishly thrown her away. The Harvest Queen had completely rewritten the destiny of the world, proving for all eternity that the most magnificent, unyielding power does not come from a heavy iron sword or a cold diamond crown, but always inevitably grows from the ground up. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of resilience and love. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would absolutely love to know how far Sarah and Kaelen's journey has reached. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.